Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series, A Ripple of Thoughtful Words for Communication at End of Life in Long-Term Care. Today's webinar is the fifth in the series, and it will be about compassion fatigue and adaptive action. On the right-hand side of your screen, in the handouts box, you can find a PDF of the slides with a place to write notes, and a PDF with a list of additional resources for communication at end of life. We've also included an additional handout in today's webinar, which is the Professional Quality of Life Scale, also known as PRO-QOL, by the Center for Victims of Torture. This handout will be discussed in greater detail during the webinar. My name is Emily Farrell, and I'm a project coordinator with the Ontario Centres for Learning, Research and Innovation in Long-Term Care, or CLRI, hosted at Bruyère. This webinar series was developed in partnership with Algonquin College and is brought to you by the Ontario CLRI. We are here to support you in these trying times, and we hope that these webinars do just that, offer you support, comfort, calmness, and strength as we continue to navigate COVID-19 together. So I'd now like to pass this over to Ruth Richardson, who will be leading this webinar. Ruth is a hospice palliative care nurse educator at Algonquin College and is the instructor behind our Communication at End of Life training program. So I'll pass it over to you now, Ruth.
Thanks, Emily. The Communication at End of Life course that the CLRI had put together had a number of posters around the room, and one said a conversation doesn't have to be long to be significant. A few thoughtful words can help a lot. And these ripples are based on that premise that hopefully some of this is significant and some of it is helpful, but it will be short because I do not have all the answers. Another poster suggested that sometimes we don't need answers, we just need some understanding. And I hope some of the content today will give you some understanding on the topic of compassion fatigue. So the path that we're going to follow today is the same as every ripple. We're going to stop for a moment and pause, and then we're going to listen to our own thoughts and feelings and put that into some perspective to move forward mindfully in the next 10 to 12 minutes and looking at the topic of the day, which is going to be self-compassion and compassion fatigue. And we're going to look at a couple of techniques to help us with that. So let's stop and take a breath and observe whatever's happening in your mind, your thoughts, your feelings. We're having them all the time, and allow the stopping and having a pause to quiet your thoughts. And maybe your thoughts are on people who are suffering or respecting people who have died due to COVID or for other reasons. And let's just take a few moments to reflect on that and allow the pause to be healing. Allow the ringing of the bowl to just move right into your breath. Allow your breath to relax you in the moment. Just to observe your thoughts and your emotions. Allow your breath to relax your body's response to fighting or flighting. And allow the breath to give you a sense of quiet and rest and peace. And in that moment of listening to your inner voice, you may have emotions that are difficult. Maybe you're suffering in some way, and just give yourself those kind words of compassion towards yourself. Give yourself the compassion that you need to move through this day. Become your best friend. And say those things that you would say to a resident or to a friend. Say those things to yourself. Offer yourself a little self-compassion. I have a meditation that says, I am enough. And then it says, no, I am more than enough. You are enough. No, you are more than enough. And knowing that, we can move forward. Take a few breaths, and if you've been closing your eyes, allow your eyes to open, and let's work on the concept of self-compassion and compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction. Naomi Raymond, in her book, Kitchen Table Wisdom, said the expectation that we have when we are immersed in suffering and loss daily is that we cannot help but be touched by this. It is unrealistic for us to have an expectation that we will not be touched by this. Sorry, guys. And it's like entering into water. And when we enter into water, we're going to get wet. We're going to enter into a compassionate response to those who are suffering. We're going to have an effect on us if we're in the presence of suffering. One of the responses and effect being compassion is that we have what they call compassion satisfaction. And it's kind of why we do what we do. It's that satisfaction we have about doing a good job, about being with a resident, knowing that you've made a difference, about working collaboratively with team members and knowing that you're a part of a team that worked well together and that you've contributed and someone else has supported you through it. It's that ability to feel I could do my job today. That is compassion satisfaction. That's the good stuff about working, of helping. There's also the bad stuff about working, and that is what they call compassion fatigue. And in this professional quality of life model, they talk about satisfaction versus the fatigue. Both are going to happen if we're going to offer compassion in our work. They divide compassion fatigue into two categories, one being burnout, which is that being overwhelmed and just not being able to cope, and possibly you know someone who's experienced that, or you yourself has experienced that. The other side of compassion fatigue, they put it in a category called compassion secondary trauma. And secondary trauma just means that you are in the presence of someone who is experiencing some trauma. It might be the actual act of dying and suffering, emotionally and physically suffering through that. And being in the presence of suffering, sometimes we experience a secondary trauma, which can produce compassion fatigue. For being in the presence of suffering, we know is holistic in nature. It affects all of us in suffering. It's not just our mind or it's not just our soul, but it's holistic in nature. So of course, compassion fatigue is the same. And being mindful of those signs of experiencing compassion fatigue, our body, mind, soul, psychologically. So there's a list here, and you probably could produce your own list, but recognizing what is compassion fatigue in you is helpful to move towards trying to find more satisfaction. There's a great little tool that can help you with this, and it's called the PROQOL scale. It's available online, it's free. I printed it up, and it's one page, and it's just 30 little questions, and you score them yourself, honestly. And it divides this satisfaction and fatigue. And it divides the fatigue, again, into burnout and secondary trauma. And it gives you an opportunity to understand better these positive and negative aspects about being in the state of offering compassion to people who are suffering. So don't worry, it's not diagnosing you, it's not a psychological test, it's really just a check-in. It's an assessment of how you're doing. And it may also help you with some stress-related health problems that you're having due to the fact that you might be experiencing a fair bit of compassion fatigue. When you go on their website, the PROQOL.org website, it is full of really great information. It even gives you a slideshow that you really can use as a presentation in your work environment. It gives you the vocabulary, it gives you the little quiz, the little scoring, and it can help you personally to understand how this energy of compassion can actually increase your resilience to go forward and do more. It can help you as a team to look at ways of finding more positive aspects of what you're doing on a daily basis and to maximize that and to minimize the negative aspects because they are there with regards to helping and offering compassion. It can also, if you're in a supportive role as a nurse manager or a team leader, that you can use a one-on-one to have some vocabulary to talk to people who are maybe really struggling and are suffering from compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue, I've divided into 5 little categories for some little tips. If you find yourself scoring really high with this tool, some of the things you can do. And one we've been talking about all along is learning how to relax, learning how to know your body and to calm it down so that when you enter into something that's difficult, that you are a smaller ripple in the energy of that room. So possibly it's the breath, it's the being mindful, it's the yoga, it's body movement, just a simple gesture. The second idea is to suggest that we need to go back to our original intention of why we do what we do. I went to a nursing convention one time and they asked all of us in the auditorium to put our hands on our hearts and remember, why did we become a nurse? So in those really difficult times, we can go back to that base of why do we do what we do? What are our core values? What is your personal creed for why you do what you do? And that is your foundation. Those are your roots. That will hold you. While the storm is raging up above you, those roots will ground you. And it's good to take stock of that and say, that's why I do what I do. It's also good to celebrate your accomplishments and to remember whether you've been doing this for 3 months, 3 years, or 30 years, to go back and say, I do this well, and I'm really good at this, and to celebrate those things. And that will help your resilience to move from fatigue into satisfaction. And to talk to people. You work in a team, use your team for you and to build more resilience than against you. And to use your team members in that way means you need to be mindful to go in that direction. And of course, self-care. And we've been talking about self-care probably in every ripple that we've done. And we know that we've got to put the oxygen mask first on us. We've got to manage our own self-care before we can help someone else. Because it is the key from moving from compassion fatigue to compassion satisfaction, finding self-care. And self-care is holistic in nature as well. It's not just looking after our body or not just looking after our emotions. It's all encompassing. On this slide, I have put little ideas of things you could do for just 2 minutes or 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or actually scheduling a 30-minute break. The trick is to do this daily. It's as important as having a shower or brushing your teeth or going to the bathroom. And sometimes learning self-care practices, I have taught people to sort of say, well, if you can't remember, incorporate it against something that you normally do, like visiting the bathroom. You can do a 2-minute self-care thing while you're in the bathroom. And then that might incorporate into a 5-minute moment with another person, or actually a 30-minute moment when you come home and sit down and make the transition from work life to home life. Another self-care tool that's really great is using a reflective practice. And this is a pretty common one, the what, so what, now what. And it's just looking at what's going on, taking stock of that, really finding that pause, think and feel, and then move forward with some conclusions and to go further. This little tool has been incredible for me when I deal with difficult situations or I feel that my fatigue is starting to overwhelm me. I invite you to look at your door of your front building, and probably it has signs like this. Caution, stop, we're on outbreak. And use those signs as a little ritual for yourself to stop, take a breath or two, observe your thoughts and feelings, pause, and then from the pause, proceed mindfully to seek more satisfaction in your daily work environment than fatigue. Because Viktor Frankl, who certainly knows a lot about suffering, says between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And the trick is being mindful of that space, because the space is the place where we choose our response, and we are in charge of that. and we can choose a response that lies towards our growth and freedom. It's a brilliant quote. It's a brilliant thought to take with you. If your compassion doesn't include yourself, it's not complete. So keep that in mind. If you feel that your compassion is driving you towards compassion fatigue, then start offering some compassion towards yourself. And you might find that it'll move you back onto the other side. Joan Halifax says that many of us think that compassion drains us, that fatigue side of compassion, but she promises us that it actually can be something that enlivens us. This is positive to think in this way, because to sustain our passion and the love for our work that we do for our residents, we must experience that satisfaction part of compassion on a regular basis. I would say on an hourly basis, because the satisfaction balances the fatigue. They are like the good, the bad, the pleasure, the pain, the dark, and the light. And Mala says that when we see the darkness and enter into that suffering, it helps us realize the importance of the light. So I encourage you to try the Pro-QOL assessment scale, and may you find moments of compassion satisfaction today, moving forward, and in the days to come.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruth. I think it's really important to highlight here, as you did at the end, that balance is the key, and you'll experience both compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. But the trick is to figure out how to go about balancing the two. So we do have some time for questions now. So if you have any thoughts or feelings that you'd like to share with the group, or any questions that you have for Ruth, please enter those into the questions box now.
I find it really interesting to go back to kind of why are you doing what you're doing? Because usually that comes from a really good space. And if you can go back and find that on a daily basis, I certainly know other things in my life, like parenting or being in a relationship. And when you're having those difficult moments, to kind of go, why did I become a parent? What is driving me to stay in? Why did I get married in the first place? And I find those really are the roots of the relationship, that if we can go back to those roots, the storm can rage above us if we're this tree and we've got branches, having the breezes affect us, that our roots can be really strong if we go back to that. So I thought that compassion tip was very powerful to go back to.
Definitely. So we have had a comment come in that says it's so important to recognize that empathy and compassion are so connected.
Yeah.
And we've also had a question that come in that said, we are struggling with staff returning post-positive COVID results and feeling moral distress regarding the passing of residents.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they are falling into the suffering side because of their health as well. And I just really encourage those people to find sources of strength as a team leader, to find spaces for those people to be heard, to allow them to know that they're not in this alone, that you have their back, and recognizing that they're not isolated. This is such a time of isolation, and isolation is not a comforting concept when you're suffering. And so that makes it really difficult. But it sounds like just being aware of it is the first step. I don't have all the answers, and my heart goes out to all of you who are working in this field, but I wish for you the courage to find moments of satisfaction and lift that up on your floor. A laugh, a moment, not to diminish the suffering that's there, but there's a poster, I think, in our program, Communication End of Life, that talks about that just as much as we can cry with our residents in difficult times, we can also laugh and rejoice in joyful times. And they happen simultaneously together.
Exactly, definitely. We've had another comment come in that also loops into another question. So they've said, this has been very refreshing. Thank you so much. I will look to see how I may be able to foster this with my colleagues. So a question that might turn to that is, as a manager in long-term care, what can I do to prevent my team members from experiencing trauma or burnout in these trying times?
I really encourage you to go and look at that ProQOL assessment and look at the questions. It actually identifies the questions on the second page. It identifies the questions that fit into those categories, and maybe having a discussion about compassion, satisfaction, and looking at those questions and finding ways of putting that energy into those fields in your practice, and then identifying the trauma and the burnout scale as well. I find this to be very insightful, and it gives you a tool to recognize both exist and how to move in the direction of finding more satisfaction.
Definitely. So we are at the 20-minute mark, but I'll finish off with one last comment that someone said, is that this is not wasted time to do self-compassion.
No.
It's really important.
Yeah, and I think when we are caring for ourselves, people go, well, it's just me, it's just me. And it's like, but you are the vehicle, you are the precious vehicle that is there for others. And so as much as they are precious and you care for them and you love them, you must love yourself. You've got to put the oxygen mask on first. So a little self-esteem boost might be in order as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right, so I think I'll end it there. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Our last webinar in the series will run next week at this time. So that's Friday, May 29th at 11 a.m. And Ruth, if you wouldn't mind just flipping over to the next slide there.
Oh, yeah.
So here are some ways that you can connect with us at the Ontario CLRI. And just a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our website within the next week, but likely sooner. And there's also a brief evaluation survey that should pop up when the webinar closes. This survey is voluntary and it will take 3 to 5 minutes, and questions can be skipped or the whole survey can be abandoned at any moment. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yeah, take care,
everyone.
Bye-bye.